So I'd like to just take a couple of minutes and introduce our three panelists, and Carl is also up here so that after they've made their presentations and we can hopefully engage in some conversation and dialogue with them. I'm sorry, I realized that when I was sitting down here, I don't know if for those of you with the angle of the podium, if it cuts your view off of the panelists, but you might want to take advantage of the opportunity and move to some of these seats that are out front if your view is obstructed. So I'm going to go with that time-honored tradition of starting to introduce ladies first and introduce Lois Hawkins, who many of you are probably familiar with. Lois draws on a very broad experience in the public sector, having worked with federal government and the provincial governments of the Yukon, and most recently the government of Alberta. From March 2008 until October 2011, she served as Deputy Minister of Culture and Community Spirit, and in this role she met with many nonprofit organizations throughout the province. She was the senior government official responsible for implementing the provincial cultural policy, which is known as the Spirit of Alberta. She was also the co-chair of the Alberta Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Initiative, otherwise known as ANVSI, and there are several of us here who have been involved in that initiative, which is a joint initiative between government and the not-for-profit sector, and Lois was the co-chair of that initiative for 3 years. And she's also been a member of the partnering committee of the Safe Communities Initiative. So Lois, welcome. I'd next like to introduce James Temple, who's the Director of Corporate Responsibility for PwC. Sorry, I still want to go back and say the full thing, but and he's the leader of the PricewaterhouseCoopers Canada Foundation. James is a leading voice on corporate community involvement and an advocate for capacity building in the nonprofit sector. He's presented at the 2011 World Volunteer Forum, the International Corporate Citizenship Conference, TEDx Calgary, and was a judge for the 2011 Strategy Magazine Cause Plus Action Awards. James serves on a variety of nonprofit industry associations, boards, and committees, and is co-chair of the Association of Corporate Governance. Welcome, James. And then our final presenter is Marcel Lauziere, who's the president and CEO of Imagine Canada, which is a national umbrella organization for charities and nonprofits in Canada. Marcel's led Imagine Canada since 2008, establishing it as a leading voice for the sector on policy issues and promoting good standards of practice across Canada's voluntary sector. I'm just looking at my notes here, sorry. The light is poor to be able to read, but I also had a little misprint here because I don't think it was in 2001 that Imagine hosted. 2011, Imagine hosted a series of regional conferences and regional dialogues. Again, many of you may have participated in the session that was held in Edmonton, but they hosted a series of regional meetings across Canada, which culminated in the National Summit in Ottawa in late November. And I do know that many people in this audience were able to participate in that. Prior to joining Imagine Canada, Marcel served as Deputy Chief Executive of the Ministry of Social Development in New Zealand. He was the president of the Canadian Council on Social Development, and has also been the founding executive director of the Canadian Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. So welcome to all of our panelists. Now, when we asked our panelists to come and participate in the session today, we asked them to each take about 10 minutes and to reflect on two broad questions. The first is for them to speak to how they see what they see as being the opportunities and challenges facing the voluntary sector over the next 5 years. And the second was the most important things that need to occur for the voluntary sector to continue to thrive and support healthy, vibrant communities. So the process that we're going to use, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak to this individually, and then we'll open it up for some conversation. We've asked Carl to join us because we think that there's a great deal of synergy amongst uh, the points of view of these different individuals, but we'll also open up to questions from the floor after the presentations. James, would you like to start?
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Carl. You've set us up so beautifully for this part of the conversation. And I did just want to say before we dive right in, a big thank you for allowing us to take part today. And also, we have a bunch of our grant recipients. We fund professional development at PwC, and I know they're in the room, so I just wanted to give you a shout out and say congratulations. And we're really proud of you, so thank you. Now, I think it's interesting when we look at big society and where it's come from and where it's going, because what I wanted to do over a few minutes is frame out some of the big picture things to think about and trends that will flow throughout the sectors. And then talk a little bit about, what would it take to look at cross-sector collaboration in a different way? Because I don't think it's reinventing conversations. It's not about spinning our wheels and having the same conversations around the same tables, which I know many of us have. But I think it's about thinking about things differently so we can infuse innovation and collaboration into our thinking. So many of us will be familiar with the Occupy movements. I think this has changed the face of trust and integrity within business. We look at big society and the motivators behind how to empower citizen engagement, and I think we've already got it here, and in a big way. And whether or not it's coordinated in terms of the messaging, when you look at the Occupy movements, I think as business professionals and from that angle, we really need to stand up and take notice, because we have highly engaged employees who are also part of communities who are very much interested in not only how business or government or not-for-profits give back, but how we're working together in a new way. And to Carl's earlier point about millennials, I can tell you at our firm, the average age of all of our employees is under 30 years old. So it can be a bit like herding cats sometimes, because we're so keen on learning and understanding about what people are interested in, but we've had to use all new tools and experiences to engage in that kind of conversation. Interestingly enough, there's a high sophistication of what corporate responsibility means, and not only at companies, but in the not-for-profit sector itself. So you see savvy fundraisers, very high-level strategic thinking CEOs and boards of directors, and then practitioners in the industry who in many ways are being forced to think big, think differently. Where are we going to be in 10 years in an uncertain and an unclear economy and working environment? So it begs the question, are we creating new silos of expertise that existed before, but now are creating new friction points? Whereas where we were coming from is, we want more partnership and collaboration, but now we have highly skilled CR professionals, highly skilled fundraisers. I think we risk going back to have similar conversations. I'd also challenge us to transform how we're having conversations. A wise person once told me, and I think actually, Marcel, it may have been through one of your panels, that we tend in all of our sectors to have the wrong people around the right tables having the right conversations, but we need to have the right people at the right tables. And maybe not necessarily focus on our own organizations and the outcomes we hope to achieve, but to focus more on the process, on how we get there, and think differently about what process means. Because at the end of the day, change will happen. And when we look at not only organizational change, but system-level change and what that big thorny issue of capacity building looks like, I think we need to be thoughtful around thinking about one or two things we want to do and not tackle the whole gamut. And I think social enterprise is a great example of where we don't want to put the cart before the horse, although it's a fabulous opportunity. I think when we look at some of the biggest things to think about over the next 5 years, I'd highlight three things. I think a de-emphasis on the competition for funds and how we think about collaboration. We hear that word all the time, but I think what often happens in some of the lessons from big society is we can't force that to happen. We shouldn't necessarily be working alongside organizations with the same message and the same passion as ourselves. Let's think differently about how to work together and access new ideas. So whether it be a PwC of the world working with an arts organization and an energy company and understanding social bonds, I think we can learn differently through a new kind of collaboration and not put the focus on funders and fundees and things of that sort. I'd also highlight that media has taken a keen interest in this. So, there's the really exciting things to talk about. There social finance right up there. There's volunteerism. There's things and parts of for example, big society that we need to engage in. But I don't think we're actually talking about how to do it. We're just talking about concepts. And for good and for bad, media drives those conversations. But I think we have to play a role, specifically within business, on helping guide that discussion and the role that we can all play in achieving results, not achieving results for our brand or for a sector itself. So building on Carl's points, I think it really is about, what do we want to do and where are we going, and understanding what that looks like. I think with system level achievement, and the second thing I'd highlight is, again, that drive to outcomes. What does the car look like to drive there? We all know how many people we want to assist, and in a geographically constrained community, how to measure process in a different way. But we've had a wonderful experience in Canada, a broad, vast country of language, of experience within our social fabric. And we need to think about how we educate people better to have the right conversations. I would point to board governance and leadership as the first thing that we need to do. So something you'll actually see in your package and your takeaways, and something our firm will be doing, is teaching people how to read not-for-profit financial statements. If we can get back to basics and start thinking about the conversations we need to have, I think it's going to be a lot better, because things around finance and transparency, around professional development and compensation, around the not-for-profit narrative, they're what we need to be talking about. But what are the tools we need to equip people with in order to have those conversations in the right way? And I think it starts with things that might seem deceptively simple for the audience here today. But if we think about our boards, our volunteers, the people who we touch, and our donors, many of those people aren't necessarily prepared to think differently and where we need them to be and move them along that continuum. And the last thing I wanted to highlight is something a little bit out there. I wrote research and development. Companies spend tons of money on research and development. And as funders, and I know there's lots of funders in the room, so hopefully I'm not going out on a limb on this, but we need to be doing a way better job of funding organizational capacity, core operational support, to make sure that we empower not-for-profit partners the time to think and to reflect and to take risks. Because if we need to create system-level changes, that's not going to happen if we aren't engaging the workforce in any sector to think differently and to be bold in terms of the risks that they take, and to empower people to say that, sometimes it's not going to work out. But that's not necessarily a bad outcome, and if we can measure that, we can learn from it. And if companies are doing it, we got to make sure our not-for-profit partners can do that as well. Something that I introduced at TEDx Calgary was the idea of advoteering. And I don't think it's a groundbreakingly new concept. I just put advocacy and volunteering together in one word. I thought it was pretty exciting. But who knew? Who knew? But something to think about, the role that we can play in all of our organizations first. Not necessarily society or the communities in which we live and work, but how do we stand around the water cooler or embrace new ideas, and how do we become passionate about what other people care about? And coming full circle, I think when you look at the Occupy movements, that's really what that movement was all about. So I think if we can learn from that example and harness that kind of energy and redirect it to the work that we need to do and where we need to be, we've got a bright future ahead. So that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, James. That's great. Lois, maybe I could turn I was going to say the platform, but the seat over to you, the mic over to you, and ask you to make your comments.
Great, and what a nice segue in terms of that positive future. A future that I think has much promise because of people such as the people in this room. And I want to talk about 5 challenges specifically that people in government might be thinking of. As Katherine said, I'm not of government now, but I have been in the past. So I thought I would bring that kind of a perspective and talk about some of the things that I would be talking about with people in some of my former roles. And one is certainly that we do, as Jim Dinning mentioned this morning, have a wonderful opportunity with a newly elected government that, from what I've read and what I've seen, is really understanding the power of community in terms of achieving both their political but also the governmental goals. So the first one is an obvious one that anyone in Alberta knows, and that is we have been so lucky in this province to have not been affected in the kind of negative financial ways that some other countries and provinces have, which is not to say we haven't had challenges. We have. Because there have been reductions in funding, there have been reductions in interest rates, so endowments have been hit. Individuals have felt very uncertain about the future, and so they've pulled back on some of their donations. Volunteers may have not the time that they may have had before because of either fewer services, so they had to take care of family, or perhaps they had to take on another job, or they had to do other kind of things. So although we have been able to get through to this point, much probably better than other places, it's not been without costs. And looking forward, although very many positives are out there in terms of our commodity-based economy, it's incredibly uncertain. All you have to do is look just recently where Mark Carney talked about the fact that interest rates might go up. He's worried about personal indebtedness. We hear about the shale gas impact on our gas reserves, and the prices are down. Maybe they can't even sell it pretty soon. And so we see that from government's perspective, the economy is a big issue. And it's fraught with positives, but a lot of uncertainty. And uncertainty that probably up until 2008 has changed. The second challenge that I thought I'd talk about is the fact that because we have had a strong economy, in comparison to so many other places, we have drawn people of working age from all over Canada. That's been an amazing factor in terms of our diversity. But we also have one of the fastest rates of growth in our Aboriginal communities, and very young demographic. But we've also seen amazing demographics from around the world. I was at a meeting in Peace River. I couldn't believe it. I sat at a table, and there were probably 15 people, and they represented 13 different countries. That was just amazing to me. And this is in a province that's landlocked, that, people have a lot of perceptions about. But we have diversity where people might be French-speaking African people, but have very different traditions from their African cultures. And so when they come here, have a whole new set of issues that would not be easily solved by just one approach. So diversity is both a challenge, but probably, I think, one of our greatest opportunities in terms of dealing with the global world. Another is the increasing, I think, understanding by government of the complexity. And by complexity, I mean not just that it's complicated, but it's hard to see what the right answer is. And there are so many factors, it's hard to know what influences what most. And also the interdependence of factors. And so you see, as again, all of you would be aware, I'm sure, that there is a new Human Services Department. And that we see the fact that people are talking more about real engagement, so that we see more public involvement and more social cohesion. So there is an understanding of the role that all sectors, whether it's private sector, nonprofit, or government, play in dealing with this unbelievable complexity and interdependence, partly tied to those other issues that I mentioned. The other one, I think, particularly for this particular sector, is the perception that there are too many organizations and that they overlap. Personally, I think this is a wonderful thing for civic engagement. But when I was sitting in government, it was overwhelming to see the tens of thousands of organizations that are passionate about the work that they do. And the fact that no matter how much money we had, it would never be enough to fully fund those activities. And so we talk about measurement, but again, not measurement just for its own sake, but to somehow create some kind of sense of a priority. If we're putting tax money, or if you're putting private dollars or individual dollars or corporate dollars into some activity, is this the best use of those dollars to create change in the community, positive change, so that more people can fully participate? Measurement is one issue, and it's a challenge, but it also creates an opportunity for you, because especially right now, nobody knows how to do it very well. You can count some things, but you can't do it very well. And certainly in terms of outcomes, it's very complicated. But by changing the nature of the discussion, as James was saying, you can help create a new way of determining what are those ways that we can contribute resources to make the biggest impact. Another thing, again, that in government I know that I would be thinking about is the difference in the kinds of emerging organizations that I see. I was invited last fall to speak with some students, and I kind of turned the tables and I said, I want you to speak to me so I can take some ideas back into government. And it was interesting, this particular group of high-achieving young people were all talking about the ways that they participate in philanthropy or voluntary work or charity or whatever. And a number of them talked about Kiva-like organizations or ways of funding. They would have relatively small amounts of money, they would go online, and they would feel so thrilled to be able to help a farmer in the Philippines, or a woman in India who was starting a small craft co-op in her community. And that really got me thinking about the fact that many of the traditional organizations feel very stressed. Some of the very small ones who are trying to provide services feel very stressed. But this emergent area that was so different and that often used technology was really captivating and capturing the involvement in young people in different kind of ways. And when Carl mentioned Lucy's work, I immediately went on my iPad and I checked out some of the work that she's doing. But I think that we're going to need to spend some time looking at the work that people are doing. As you were saying, some of the research about how these are disruptive, but also may help to change the way that we perceive ourselves as individuals or organizations in this sector. And again, one of the things that also is emerging that I think is interesting, I can't remember how I got to it. I must have been looking at online shopping, but and I think it's the U.S. Target website. They talk about, I got to this place where they give out environmental grants and they give out community grants and educational grants to schools. And it was quite amazing to me because it was so similar to what we would have on the website when I was in government, or that nonprofit funders might, corporate groups might put on their websites. And it also occurred to me the kind of thing we've also heard earlier today, and that is that the edges between these are graying. And there's so much commonality in terms of some of the interest in the outcomes that it does lead us, I think, to some amazing opportunities for changing the conversation. So I would say, because I'm probably starting to run out of time, that the sector in Alberta, I think, is quite maybe unique. I think Marcel could tell us, because we do have some capacity building organizations like CCVO, which, by the way, anytime Katherine calls me, I'm here for her, because I think the work that she does benefits not just Calgary, but all of Alberta. And as an Albertan, that's important to me because I care about quality of life in this province. But Volunteer Alberta does some wonderful work. But we also have groups that help other small groups of people. So we have a lot of ways of building capacity. And I think that that's one of the real strengths. We practice that. We also do some very interesting things in this province about some informal alliances that I think we need to pay more attention to think about. There are little nodes of work going on that we, I think, could learn a great deal from and perhaps share that in terms of a community of practice and not just a community, a geographic kind of community. I think there are some logical partners if we start to think about outcomes. And again, a lot of that is probably going on, but may not always be front of mind. Building capacity, building capacity, building capacity, I'll keep saying that. And also I think, and I'll close on the fact that I believe because of those strengths, and because there is this newly elected government that has, again, some shared interests in outcomes, you have an opportunity to lead the construction of a new kind of discussion with government and community and the private sector. I think this is one of the most exciting times, not because it's going to be easy, but because it's going to be hard. And I think that that's the kind of thing that gets Albertans sitting up in their chair and really focused and ready to work together.
Thank you. Marcel, over to you.
Merci, Catherine. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be on stage with Carl and James and Lois and you, Katherine. And Katherine did not ask me to say this, but I just want to jump on what Lois has said. CCVO is quite a unique organization across the country, and it certainly is a model. There are very, very few organizations that work at the local, regional level like CCVO does as an umbrella on those cross-cutting issues. If there could be more CCVOs, it would be great. So anyways, and Katherine did not, tell me to say that. But, and very impressed by the organization of this conference, so thanks for letting me be here. In terms of the question, in terms of challenges and opportunities, as Katherine referred to earlier, Imagine Canada has been working over the last few years, crisscrossing the country, trying to identify what those challenges and opportunities are, and that culminated in the National Summit in Ottawa in December. And out of that, we've identified, I think, for collective action, 4 broad priorities, and I'll talk to you about them briefly, but stop on one in particular that I would like to spend a bit more time on. Essentially, the first one I think that's come out, and this has been across the country, is the whole issue of volunteerism. And the issue not being the number of volunteers, as you probably know, Canadians volunteer in big, big numbers. It's more around the expectations and the changing expectations of volunteers. And people like Jamie, of course, know a lot more about this than I would, but certainly a number of issues were raised around how youth are volunteering, for example. And we know that youth volunteer in very large numbers, so that's not the issue, but their expectations are very different, and you touched on that, I think, a bit, Lois, just a few minutes ago. And a number of charities and nonprofits are trying to figure out how to deal with that and how to work with youth in a different way. And then at the other end of the spectrum are what we call high-skilled volunteers, people coming in later on in their career who want to volunteer, but once again, volunteer in a very different way, and their expectations are very high, and charities are struggling, I think, very often in how to work with that. A second priority that came out is very much around paid human resources. So the whole issue of skills and really, how do we attract the best and the brightest to come and work in our sector? How do we get on the radar screens, for example, of university and college students to start thinking about our sector as a place where they want to work? A lot of people in my generation, I think, fell into the sector almost by accident. Not necessarily a bad thing. I think there are a lot of good people working in this sector, myself included, but why not think about it in a more strategic way? Why not think about it in a more deliberate way? I agree the lines are blurring within the sector, but how do we get onto the radar of those young Canadians so that they think of our sector as a place where they can have a very strong career? And I think that's going to be a priority for us in the coming years. The third, no surprise to anyone, is the funding structure. So the changing nature of funding and financing of the sector. And essentially there are 3 broad sources, right, where charities and nonprofits get their funding. The first one is, not in any order of priority, but certainly the first one is funding from government, contracts, contributions, grants. That's going to continue, but it's not going in the right direction for all kinds of reasons. And we have to accept that. Many governments are in deficit situations. They're looking at how they're going to reduce their costs. But even if they were not in deficit situations, most governments, and we're seeing it with the big society in the UK, most governments in the Western world are rethinking the role of government and how they want to play and how they want to interact. So there's going to be a big impact on the funding of organizations, and we have to be ready for that. The second source is philanthropy, broadly defined, and how Canadians give. And there again, we're not in a crisis situation, but at the same time, we're starting to see a slow erosion of the donor base. How do we get and how do we talk and how do we challenge Canadians to give and to give more? James talked about, in a way, also corporate philanthropy, which is changing. The expectations are changing, the relationship is changing. So that's another big area, of course, of funding for the organizations, and one of changing expectations. And the third one, and Carl spoke a lot about this also, is the whole issue of earned income, which includes, of course, social enterprise, social finance, and certainly social finance, social enterprise, like Carl says, is certainly not the magic bullet, but it will be part of the toolkit that organizations need to look at. In fact, it is the biggest When you look at those three sources, that's where growth is actually happening. It's not happening in the two other areas. So how do we start mainstreaming some of these ideas? How do we make sure we have the necessary skills to be able to do it effectively? Do we have a regulatory environment that is conducive to this type of work? What are the risks? So that's another big issue. So those are I would say, three big priorities: volunteerism, paid human resources, funding. The fourth one, which I think actually is the most important of all, is the need for us to reframe our narrative. And Carl, you touched a bit about that in terms of public understanding in your presentation. We haven't taken much time to talk to Canadians about what we're all about. I'm not talking about simply our own organization, talking about the sector, the impact, the contribution, the role we have that we have in society. And because we haven't taken time to develop that narrative and to talk to Canadians, others have come in and they are actually developing that narrative for us. That's the media, very often in negative terms, unfortunately, and very often politicians. And a lot of that narrative comes from misconceptions about what the sector is all about and the contributions and the role that we can play. I'll give you a few indicators. We know generally in society right now there is a rising level of cynicism, not just about charities, about politicians, about lawyers, about different institutions. It's out there, and we're seeing it not only in Canada, but around the world, and we are part of that. Every survey that's been conducted will show that charities are trusted by Canadians. But if you look at recent surveys, we're starting to see some cracks in that level of trust. People are starting to ask increasingly questions about the work that we do. I'll give you a few concrete examples, I think, where we realize there's a need for a new collective narrative, and a narrative which would be a foundational narrative that brings in the whole sector through our commonalities, not through the silos. A few years ago in Parliament Hill, there was this bill that was essentially proposing to cap salaries, compensation in the charitable sector, as if that was the biggest challenge that we were facing. We started to meet with MPs from all parties, and this was supported by all parties in the House. We thought that after a short conversation, they would realize that that's probably not the way to go. That was not at all the reaction. The misconceptions about what the sector is all about. Are you not volunteers? So of course, volunteerism is at the core of who we are as a sector. Volunteerism is hugely important, but there are also, of course, professionals and people working in this sector. But there's this sense of, if you are being paid, then you should pay very little, because you're doing out of the goodness of your heart. You're doing nice things. You're nice people, and of course we are. We don't want to go against that, of course. But that whole sense of what the sector is all about, that we are actually dealing with some of the most intractable economic, social, cultural, environmental issues this country is facing, and for that we need the skills and the talent, and we need to be able to bring in people. Fortunately, because the sector came together as a strong voice, including universities and hospitals as part of that conversation, we were able to get an amendment, and finally that was killed. But that may well come back. But for me, that was a strong indicator, and it's not about pointing the finger to the members of Parliament. Well, why would they think otherwise? We've never actually taken the time to talk to them about what we're all about, the contribution and the role of the sector. So for me, coming out of those conversations, it was a bit of a mea culpa, collectively for us as a sector, that we haven't taken the time to do that. About a year and a half ago, CBC decided they were spending a full day investigative journalism around fundraising and fundraising costs. It was, I have to say, bad journalism. The data they were presenting was flawed. They'd never talked to a number of organizations the sector to better understand, but the general message was, careful, those charities out there will get you if you don't ask the right questions, if you don't scrutinize. Of course, we have nothing against transparency and accountability. We push that, very, very forcefully. But at the same time, the message coming from that whole day of coverage from the CBC was, I think, very harmful for the sector, and was another, I think, indicator that we haven't been talking to people about the cost of doing good and the fact that you do need to raise dollars to actually have an impact. Then we have international development organizations where Canadians have been donating over the last few years to major international crises. And there's still that sense out there, why isn't Haiti yet a G7 country, right? We've poured so much money into it, right? Why are there still problems? That sense of organizations are working, but they're not working for impact. They're not making your dollar really work for them. And then, of course, administrative costs, the cult of efficiency, right? The best indicator. If you want to give to a charity, you want to find that charity that spends the least possible on its administrative costs. because we still have that sense that we're about good things and nice people doing good things rather than organizations actually trying to address some of the most difficult issues we have. And in fact, if you want to give it an organization that's going to have an impact and change things, you probably want to give to an organization that has infrastructure, that has the wherewithal, the necessary skills to be able to make that change and have that necessary impact. But there's still that sense out there that it is all about efficiency, and we have to move away from that. Not that efficiency is a bad thing, it's a good thing, of course, and you want to be transparent about it, but you also want to look at impact and you want to look at results. So there's an organization now called, many of you may know, called Charity Intelligence, which is actually now a ranking organization based on inputs, not on results or impact, but on levels of fundraising costs, administrative costs, compensation, as if those particular indicators were to tell you anything about the impact of the organizations on the ground. And the last one, which I think is very recent, which touches on a very different piece, but still goes to our narrative about who we are, is you may have noticed in the last federal budget, there have been some changes announced around political activity and what charities can and cannot do. When we look at what's actually been announced, that situation hasn't changed dramatically. So I think we can probably work with the government around this issue. But there has been a message out there that charities may not have the role that we would like them to see in public policy. And Carl, you were talking about that in your talk also, about the need, and not just to oppose, the need to participate in public policy. Canada has a very long, and charities have a very long and proud history in Canada. Think of the Cancer Society and health charities around tobacco and smoking. Think of drinking and driving. Think of the environmental organizations pushing for a treaty with the US around acid rain and the success of that. Think of the development of the disabilities registered savings plan that came from the sector, and more recently at the G20, the Canadian International Development Organizations putting forward the maternal and child health initiative, which is now on the agenda of the G20. So we have been part of public policy, and that's why Max Bell and others have these schools, Maitri, where they're actually helping organizations understand the importance of public policy and how you do it well. So if you look at all of those different messages, for me the most important priority is for us to come together collectively, figure out how we talk to Canadians differently, not about how great our organizations are, it's not about the organizations, it's about the impact and the results on the ground. And because we haven't taken the time to do it, I think there are some serious misunderstandings. If we can actually develop that narrative, work together, talk differently, use the same type of language, I think down the road we will attract people to come and work with us. We will attract the best volunteers. We will attract funding. I think this is probably where we need to come together, environmental organizations, international development, social services, education, arts. We have very different business lines, but we also have and Alan Northcott reminds me of this constantly, similar values, similar principles, a desire to engage. Mike was talking earlier about the passion of the sector. So there is, I think, a need for us to come together and develop that narrative. It is, to go back to the question that was asked of me, a huge challenge, of course, but it is also a huge opportunity that I think we need to seize. Thank you.
Wow. So as I've listened to the comments from each of the three of you and reflect on Carl's conversation earlier this morning, I'm just struck by several things. One, that there are some really great opportunities, but also some really great challenges. Marcel's talked about the issue around political advocacy. And just if I can put in a plug for those of you who are here who aren't certain about what you're able to do in terms of political advocacy, back on our table back in the back corner there, we have copies of the resource that we developed several years ago, which if Bob Wyatt was here, he would be saying this is still the best thing out, telling you what you can do. So please feel free to pick up copies and take that with you. But the issues around how we engage in political advocacy, the opportunity and the challenge about dealing with a new government, and looking at how we can influence the agenda and work with them in different ways. The challenges about working in an environment where a number of people have talked about the merging of the sectors and the challenges that presents, both opportunities in terms of working more closely with the business community and with government, but also the capacity challenges that poses for us in the sector. So I think you've raised a number of really great and interesting topics. I'd like to open it up for questions from the floor. If anybody has, we have a couple of people who have mics, if you just want to put up your hand. Oh, no, Aditya, you're holding up the mic. You don't have a question. There's a question over here. If you can put up your hands and feel free to, if we have more than one at a time, we can bring the mics to you. But I'd just like to open the opportunity for you to engage.
Thank you. I think very interesting comments. In the last 6 months, I have had several encounters with people along this line. One, I received a letter, came back to the office at the beginning of January from a donor indicating that he wanted me to send him my salary and a couple other people's salaries and our intentions for the year so he could decide whether or not he would continue to donate. I looked up records. He was giving us about $25 a year. So I responded in what I thought would be a gracious way. And then I went to 2 different community organization meetings with Rotary type groups, community service groups, who were engaging me in conversations around, again, salaries, but also around the Charity Intelligence site and telling me how they weren't going to fund some other very, very well-known groups in the city who are doing outstanding work because of this. And, I tried to have the conversation back around, all the points that we know. I guess my question would be, is there a role for, as we look at maybe these blurring of communities, is there a role for the corporate world in helping us to tell that story better about what we are doing in the not-for-profit world? Sometimes it's very hard, I think, as a not-for-profit organization to speak up and say, we need to speak up, but for us to be credible in saying that, hey, there's a reason why we're doing this. But I think that we need to see some of the other sectors standing up and saying that this kind of analysis is not helpful.
I would applaud you for raising that point, and I think it's an important one because many corporations don't think about the portfolio and the breadth and the depth of their skills and how they can be supporting these kind of conversations. Oftentimes, I think what happens is people sit and they fund, and there's that adage I think you brought up, you can throw a party and it could be the most fabulous party, but if you don't tell anybody about it or they're not wanting to come, nobody will show up, and then you can't achieve anything. So to your point, I think there's a big discussion that needs to take place around what the right ways are maybe to measure outcomes, to look at the merits of things like charity focus or charity intelligence, but be thoughtful around what is not told in terms of that story. And I think there's probably a lot of funders in the room who would welcome the kind of conversation to help position some materials or the right conversations around that. Because at the end of the day, too, if you think about it, for the funder, if you're funding an organization, the same questions will then come to the funder to say, well, we want to know this of the charity. Well, why did you fund them? Or if you're at a shareholder meeting and a shareholder asks, creating that kind of conversation together will be helpful across the board.
Marcel, do you have a...
Yeah, and I agree entirely what James was saying, and it's a great question. 2 things, I guess. One, it is really important to have champions outside the sector that also are saying the same types of things that we want to say, and I think corporations on that front would be really important. I know very few corporations that would agree to be evaluated on their inputs rather than on their outcomes and the results of their business. So I think corporations need to come out and help us on that front. The other piece I would say, though, is we need to be talking to ourselves internally as a sector, because in many cases we've been our own worst enemy in a way. If I think of administrative costs and that cult of efficiency, how many of us have said, give to us, or give to me because our administrative costs are lower. Give to us because our compensation points are lower. So we have helped build that view on the outside, that those are the indicators that you want to look at. So I think ourselves as a sector, we have to turn that around and start talking to our donors, to our volunteers, to our stakeholders about the results and the impact. Of course, look at the efficiency, transparency, the numbers should be out there, but more importantly, look at whether or not we're having results. And for that, I think we have to be talking to ourselves. But I think having a very frank discussion internally if we're going to change the narrative.
Lois, you were indicating you'd like to speak.
I'd make 2 points about it. First of all, I think the nonprofit sector, in one way, you're getting recognition because this started with the CEOs of big corporations getting, obscene salaries and payouts. But we're seeing the same in the publicly funded sector. People are saying, well, how much does that hospital administrator make? How much does that university president make? So that's part of it, is there is this not necessarily a very positive human characteristic out there right now. So that's the first point. The second one is the kind of thing that I think all of us mentioned before, and that is if you're not telling your story, somebody else will. And there are so many misperceptions. That's why I mentioned the one, which I heard all the time as deputy minister, and I know the minister of the day did too. Well, there's so many of those groups, and they look like they're doing all the same thing. And the same goes. I don't know how many times I heard people say, well, I see there's an executive director who makes $100,000 a year. Why is all that money going to their salary? So if you're not filling that story, if you aren't making, identifying champions to tell collective stories about the outcomes that you're involved in that void, someone else will fill in the space.
Do you know what I would add as well is I would challenge all of us to stop using the word efficiency and continue to use the word effectiveness. Because at the end of the day, efficiency doesn't mean effectiveness and vice versa. And if we're to be truly effective and create the right narrative, we need to understand what that means for the donor. So to your earlier point, that story might be about the fact that salaries fund X, Y, Z, and this is why funders will talk to us and why they celebrate our success. Because it might not even have to be a message that comes from you, it can come from your influencers.
Carl, do you have a view on that one?
Excuse me. I think I'm preaching to the converted here on these issues. I think what I would possibly add is, can we think much more about visualization techniques for data? So using infographics to try and shift the focus of the debate so that it's about outcomes. And one example that there's someone really good called Beth Cantor who talks about network nonprofits. And Beth's highlights the Indianapolis Museum of Art and their dashboard so that it's not about inputs, it's all about outcomes and outputs, and I'd like to try and see us do a bit more of that. Otherwise, we all have to stand up actually. We have a collective responsibility on this issue. We see this in the UK where we don't defend some fundraising techniques that get sort of lambasted in the media, and we all have a shared responsibility. And if that means we put our heads above the parapet, we have to do that.
Other questions?
Jamie Neeson, Volunteer Calgary. In my former life, I worked as a corporate funder, and one of the things I think it's great that we could have corporate champions, but it was my experience that corporations are it's unlikely for them to spend their political capital to advance our cause. They're trying to get pipelines built, they're trying to do all kinds of things, and they're spending their political capital that way. So the foundation folks, the community investment folks may entirely be on our side, but the government relations folks that they pay scads of money to affect public policy are likely not going to spend their political capital advancing the cause of our sector. So I think that there's a reality check there in terms of who we're working with in the corporations. And to recognize that, and that's really more to the point that I was wanting to make, is that corporations spend millions and millions of dollars to affect the regulatory environment. We don't have that luxury, and so we do need to have those partners and those champions. But I think to the point you were making is that it must start within. I would suggest it has to start with our boards, and our boards being willing to take a stand and say, we're fine that our overhead cost is X, because it is these results show us that that is a requirement. But I'm wondering from Carl, from Marcel in particular, Katherine as well, are there specific messages that you think we as individual organizations we need to start carrying to our policymakers and to our other funders? There are very specific things and messages that we need to send that will help our cause.
Well, I think, Jamie, the one thing that I would challenge on is in the corporate setting, I think oftentimes, and it goes back to the narrative, is we often come within our fundraising communities and with our strategy hats on with a very specific pitch. And in speaking to other companies, I think what would be effective as a sector is if we said, rather than talk directly to an issue, what are some of the spillover achievements that could be created by addressing things that aren't necessarily hitting the nail on the head? Because to bring many executives and boards and people along that continuum, sometimes it's not that kind of conversation that needs to take place to begin with. We need to have the right conversations about other things. So when we talk about accessing political capital or the breadth of networks and other things, let's figure out, I always call it the what's in it for me, for the people we're talking to, because if we can understand what that is, we can begin to bring people along with us. So then when we're ready to have those conversations, they can take place. Because I don't disagree that, we have some very challenging times ahead of us in a variety of industries. But I think if we can create that safe environment to have conversations to talk about recruitment and retention, research and development, things that touch all of our organizations, no matter what sector we're in, we can really focus on that light at the end of the tunnel and take the stream to get there.
Marcel?
Two things. I think, Jamie, you're absolutely right around their boards. We absolutely need to get to our boards of directors, and they need to be very strongly in support of this new narrative. One, because it will help us as organizations, but also remembering that the boards are made up of all the other parts of society and the economy, corporate, government. So we have access to a huge pool of influencers, and we're not, I think, working in a very strategic way. In terms of what organizations can do, I think we're almost, this is really tough to do, try to figure out what that narrative is, what are the key messages are that people will agree with, but we are at a time, I think, I'm hearing more and more issues like the first question that was raised. People, I think, are realizing now that there is a need to speak and to speak differently. And this is not about a circle the wagons type approach, deficit type approach. It's actually a strengths-based approach. But we now have a number of organizations across the country who want to work on this, including CCVO at the regional level. We've got the environmental organizations. The health charities wanted to go off and do their own narrative. We're trying to talk so that we actually come all together, because 90% of the messages will be the same. And if we can work on that, and I know, Jamie, you're interested in working with us on that, we can bring in the right people with marketing and branding experience. It's not going to be easy, but I think we can actually move the arts a bit at least. My hope would be that at the end of the day, that across the country, across the sector, we have essentially the same relatively simple messages for our editorial boards, for our boards of directors, for the municipal governments, for all of the influencers across the country are starting to hear the same thing, where we are moving away from, I wouldn't say we're moving away from efficiency, that probably would be a bad message, but starting to use different types of language around effectiveness, around impact, and that we start talking to each other. So I don't know exactly where it's going to go, but where I do feel is that there's a sense now that this is the time to do it, and there seems to be an agreement that we need to do it now.
Lois?
I think there has been this tradition of an adversarial relationship between the parties, that if it's in the interest of government, then it can't be in the interest of the community or business or vice versa. That's the part that I think, whether it's changing or whether it's something that we can help and nudge in that direction, is something that I think is very interesting. And now being outside of government, I can look at things a little bit differently. And when I reflect back being in government, is how much energy that I had to spend trying to break down that adversarial assumption from other sectors. And I just wonder what we could all do if we recognize that obviously we have some different interests. Obviously, I guess pipeline companies are there to build pipelines. But if they also have an interest in public engagement, well, that's a common area that I think government has an interest in, and probably the community does too. So find the places of common interest and grow them, recognizing there will be places where you'll not just have differences, but actively perhaps even have conflict. But I believe that there is opportunity, and I can't speak for everywhere, but I can speak for here, that we have those kind of opportunities to begin that, and that some of it will work, and that's where the research comes in, to learn about how maybe we can do things better. even learn from the things that don't go so well, so that we recognize those things maybe either we need to work on more, or that are the very things that become the red herrings that we chase.
I'm just going to take Jamie, I think I heard you mention my name, so I'm going to take advantage of that to speak to that from a CCVO perspective as well, because I think this is a really big issue. As Marcel said, I'm really pleased that on a national level, Imagine's taking a lead in trying to work on that narrative. In our own work over the last couple of years, we've been increasingly using similar language. You may not have picked up on it yet, but certainly in our language to government when we talk about the role of the sector. And it's come from a number of places. We were asked a number of years ago to get involved in developing a workforce strategy for the voluntary sector. And when we looked at the strategies that were developed by other subsectors, whether it was oil and gas or manufacturing or retail, what we noticed was that for those different parts of the economy to be able to meet their workforce requirements in the future, they were going to need to organize, they were assuming that there would be services available in community services for settlement of immigrants, skills upgrading, ESL training, childcare services, recreational activities for families that they were wanting to attract or retain in their communities. And I could go on for some time. And what we recognized was, gee, who does most of this work? It is our sector. And we started to position our language around, in our interactions with government in particular, that the voluntary sector is not on the side here. We are central to the economic health and activity and vibrancy of this province. And I'm often frustrated when organizations look at their individual functions and put that front and center without placing it into a broader context that I think would help contribute hugely in terms of building the awareness of what we collectively do, regardless of whether we're a theater or we're an organization that serves children with critical handicaps or incarcerated individuals, whatever the aspect of our work is, we really contribute to a strong economy, and I think that we need to frame it differently. So that's my spiel. Other questions? Anybody else have questions there?
I've already got the mic, so I can go. I wonder if we could shift to another question. The future of the sector depends on attracting bright young people into the sector. Have we thought that through? Just wondering, how do we do it? And what does it mean for existing structures? Are the large ones going to take over, as we heard Carl say, because they've got the expertise, or are they going to be the last ones to attract this new culture, new thinking? I mean, I could have tweeted this old-fashioned verbal kind of conversation, and we all could have had a nice conversation over our iPads. What's going to change? Is this sector going to look a lot different if we're really successful? What if we're successful in attracting a lot of bright young people into the sector? How do we do it, and what does it mean for the sector?
Well, I think a lot of it will come down to cross-sector professional development opportunities. I think what you see a lot with millennials is this urge to get involved, and rather than driving people to create their own charity, we have enough charities, that if we look to helping people have another experience beyond work, it goes beyond paid service and paid experience. It's about enacting change into the outcomes a younger generation would want to achieve. To your question, what does that look like? And flat out asking young people, how do you want to be engaged? What do you want to do? But you have to take responsibility as well. It's not just going to be handed to you on a silver platter, which we know is a challenge with the millennial mentality anyway. I guess I could say that because I'm a millennial too. So. But I do think it's helping people look across sectors and a variety of experiences and getting out of just not-for-profits, just corporate, but doing it in an authentic way without losing the identity and trying to find what that balance looks like.
Marcel?
And I agree entirely with James, and it's important when we say attract people to the sector, it's not in the sense of wanting people just to stay in the sector, because we really believe that people should be moving around. But I think we have very, very strong attributes in the sector that we haven't been talking a lot about. And things are changing. I mean, we are seeing government rethink its role in many cases. In many cases, going down the road, I talked a bit about public policy. The nonprofit and charitable sector is going to be even more important in the whole development of public policy. That's something that young grads may not even know at this point, and we want to attract some of those best policy minds. We need skills around social finance and social entrepreneurship. I have no skills in that type of area. I wouldn't say that in my board, so please don't repeat it, but I do have a board member here. I forgot about that. Sorry, swipe that from the record. I have other skills. But you know, we are increasingly moving into a very complex environment. We're looking at, you know, high levels of governance, social finance, social entrepreneurship. So we do need to get and attract the best and the brightest in these particular areas where perhaps in the past we haven't done a lot in terms of bringing those people in. So I think the sector will look different in a few years if we do that. In our conversations with millennials and, you know, next generation, what often, and that touches on what James is saying, there's often the sense that in our sector we do not believe in careers, or we don't invest in professional development, we don't invest in continuing education, and I think that's to our own detriment. I think if we are going to attract the next generation, we have to look at ways where we can do that. And often our response to that is, well, we don't have the resources to do that. We can't do professional development, right? Well, in fact, if we look at our collective resources at a local level or regional level, national level, our resources are huge. We're just not thinking in the right way. But I think if we can start thinking that way and start talking to youth in that way, I think we will attract them. And I think the sector will change, I think, for the better.
I'm going to ask Carl and then Lois.
I think there are things that we have to do as a sector and things we have to do as individual organisations. I think the things we have to do as a sector is, first of all, convince this generation that we're still relevant. I worry that they look at issues like charity law and how much you're allowed to spend on advocacy and stuff like that. And I think, what has that got to do with the fact that I want to solve that? And I think we have to think about language. Words like charity and volunteering for people who see themselves as activists, it doesn't mean anything. So I think we have to think about the relevance thing. As individual organisations, I think we have to think about the working sort of attitudes and cultures that millennials bring with them, and in particular their sort of use of technology and their understanding about informality in the workplace. I see too many organisations that don't understand social media, see the whole sort of culture of informality and of puncturing the membrane as being so different to the command and control approach that campaigners often want. And I think the second thing we have to do is, it's a slight spin on Marcel's point, can you as an organisation think about what are the job roles that you need in 5 years' time? Because the organisation that you'll be running in 5 years' time isn't the one that you're running now, but quite often we think about the job roles that we need now. So do you still need fundraisers in 5 years' time, or do you need financiers? Do you need data analysts in 5 years' time, or gut instinct sort of campaigners? And I think this thing about data, it's come up quite a bit on the panel today. I'm convinced social change in the future is going to be more and more about data, and I think those young people can help us with that. I don't think we're equipped enough to do it now.
Lois, thank you.
I listened to this wonderful podcast, and David LaPiana, who some of you might know from the Stanford Center for Innovation, I think it is, was one of the speakers, but it was a fellow named Robert Egger, who raised something very interesting to me about this issue of where do we get the people for the organizations for the future. And Robert Egger, who's with, I think, a sort of medium-sized nonprofit in Washington, D.C., talked about sort of the characteristics of people in this millennial generation, but also I think speaks to, maybe all of us. And that is, we want to do well, but we want to do good. And I think that's something that's very exciting, again, about the potential, and for nonprofits to start to think about how they position themselves. Because the other thing that this fellow mentioned, he said, the new generation will want to incorporate philanthropy in how they live their lives, how they make money, and how they spend their money. Who best to help shape, I'll call it kind of a kind of moral map for people than the nonprofit sector, who can start to address those values that are embedded in society. So it's kind of a little bit different kind of a tangent, but it's talking not about things out there or even intellectual things, but what's in people's hearts. And I think that may be something that, again, in that new conversation that we need to have, we can start to think about that.
I think we have, thank you. I think we have time for perhaps one more question. Is there another one out there? Please, Peter.
Yep, I think the green light's on. Yep, okay. Yeah, I'd like to bring us back to the youth in a different context. And if I was a young person today looking at the nonprofit sector, one of the questions I would ask myself is, where were you when I graduated from university with a debt of $40,000? And I think there's an us and a them. I mean, I'm using that as an analogy of a situation of uncertainty generally in society. The fact that, you know, the employment context of young people entering the workforce is very different, and it's changing as we speak. And not only that, they are entering that workforce with increasing levels of financial debt. And I think this is an issue that in a sense has been placed on students and their parents and their families as saying this is something that they have to struggle with. And yet it affects society. It affects the way young people see society and the way their relationship with themselves. It's an issue that affects not only the nonprofit sector and the capacity of young people to look at our society with some favor, but it also affects public sector organizations and private sector organizations as well. Where are we in relationship to this issue? And I think that that's something, if we do that, and again, looking at what Marcel was saying, what's in it for them? What's it, you know, in their day, if we step up to the plate for young people and take on as a sector a key issue that's important for them, they're going to remember who we are and start to look at us as a place that cares about their place in society and their place in our organizations. So, any comments?
Do you know what? It's funny. I went exactly through this when I was looking for my first job at a school, and I worked at a few large charities before I went into the corporate setting. And, you know, it sounds kind of funny, but I think as simple as it is young people want to know, okay, here's kind of what the plan looks like. Is the money there? Do I feel like I'm going to grow and develop, and can I create a career? And I think in the not-for-profit sector, we tend to be guilty of sometimes focusing on the things that aren't going right and a bit of a doom and gloom out there in the marketplace. And for a lot of young people who want to go and change the world, we've created an environment that isn't conducive of the kinds of conversations they want to have or feel like they can play a role in transforming the dialogue itself. So I think it even comes back to when we can get those bright minds into our workplaces, how do we engage them with leadership or to lead, you know, teams with your CEO or let them have the earphones in because that's the way they work better, and having a young person feel like it's okay and we're supportive of that. Many companies, including our firm, does that. And a great example I wanted to share because I think it's relevant is most of our audit teams they're probably like 20 to 23 years old. Everyone sits there with their earphones on. And something I did last week was brought around a cookie cart, appeal to the stomach. And I just said, so did you hear that the diversity team has a 3-month secondment? So if you want to, you know, have one audit client rather than 8, you can go and help our diversity team think differently about that. By the way, do you think our foundation can do that? Anybody want to take on that kind of role? Let's talk to leadership about it. Help me create the narrative. And you'll see that across all the firms. It's not just PwC, but I think when we talk about what we could do in our own not-for-profits, it starts there with that kind of leadership and not being afraid of new ideas, because sometimes it's difficult.
Anyone else want to respond to Peter's comment? Marcel, and then
I'll take
Carl.
Peter will take that as a comment, not as a question, I hope, because and it's a comment, in fact, that I kind of agree with. In terms, certainly the student debt load. I'm in Quebec right now. My kids are in the university CEGEP system, so in the streets right now it's huge. So that is a big issue, which is very, very much on our radar right now. But I think the point you're making is we have to show the relevance of the sector to the lives and to the realities of this next generation. And if we don't, we're going to be just, set aside, and youth will want to move somewhere else. And we really have to be careful about that it's not about the organizations, that it's about the greater good, and about recognizing, in fact, that they are, and we sense, I think everywhere we're sensing that intergenerational almost tension right now around the sense that we don't understand the issues they're facing, the economy in which they're living, and their jobs. And unless we show not only some interest, but some real understanding of that, I think it's going to be really difficult. So that I think is a very profound comment, Peter, and I agree with it. It's a hard one, but I agree.
Carl, one final comment.
In the UK, this is the first generation in a long time where parents feel that their children will have a worse future than they themselves had. It's a really big issue for us in the UK. I think there are two things I'd like to see us, one thing stop doing and one thing start doing. First of all, if students are graduating with $40,000 of debt, they can't afford to buy a house and they can't get a job, asking them to be unpaid interns, I think, is not acceptable at the minute. That's not even paying them sort of a living wage or anything. So I think we need to stop doing that. But secondly, I think the average age of a trustee in the UK is about 57. Yeah? Why are we not trying to get more young people to be trustees, to skill them up so that they can compete in the jobs market, and at the same time understand how their sort of motivations for social change have to be blended with the institutional realities of running an organisation?
Great points. I know I'm standing here with a list of questions that I wish I had opportunity to pose to this panel, but I know, Mike, I can't see you, you're off behind the lights, but I know I can feel your presence there. Saying to me, Katherine, it's time to wrap this up, it's time for lunch. And so I'm going to do that and thank our panelists for an excellent contribution and stimulating more conversations that I think will continue throughout this lunch period. Thank you very much.